All right. I see folks are still trickling in a little bit, but since we do have a lot of content to cover, I think we're going to get started since we're now at 1 minute after. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and welcome to another session of Real Talk, PPIL's Sexuality Education Series for caregivers and other adults. If you are comfortable participating in one of our practice scenarios or helping us answer some questions, please send a message to the host right now. It'll come in anonymously, and then we'll just know to call on you later as a volunteer. Great. Well, this is the third session in our series, Real Talk. It's all about creating healthy conversations with young people surrounding sexuality and sexual health. And today we're going to be focusing on how to talk to young people about consent. So hopefully you were able to join some of our previous sessions as well, but if not, we have recorded all of our sessions and we'll be posting those recordings to our YouTube channel, so you can definitely catch up there. My name is Addie Zwick. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Downstate Community Engagement Coordinator here at PPIL. And I've been talking to people about sexuality and sexual health for about 5 years now.
My name is Devin Legassi. I am one of the STI HIV specialists upstate. I use she, her pronouns as well. And I have been talking and teaching about sexual health and sexuality education for about the past 10 years actually now. So it's been a minute. In case you are new to Zoom, we do have a couple of quick guidelines. We are going to keep everybody muted while we're presenting, just to cut down on any sort of background noises or distractions. And like Addie mentioned, you can chat questions in directly to the host. So if you have a question you want to ask, feel free to send that our way. And we'll be taking stops periodically throughout the presentation to answer any questions that come in. We do have a couple of goals for this workshop. So the first goal is to define the elements of consent. So what that really means, the components that make up consent. And we're also going to explore what consent-related topics adults should be discussing with their young people.
All right, as I mentioned, this is the third session in our Real Talk series. Next week on September 1st, we're going to be having a session on gender and sexuality, and then we'll have some more sessions following that to round out our series. So if you're interested in attending any of these workshops, please keep an eye out for the follow-up email. We will send out a registration link in there, and we also will have a QR code at the end of this slideshow so that you can scan that and register for the next session if you'd like. And as I mentioned, if you miss any of the sessions, we will be posting those recordings to our YouTube channel. So just a few ground rules for the workshop. We want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. You know, we're all adults here, so I trust that you all know what you need. I do want to put a little bit of a content warning on this workshop just because we are talking about consent, which means that there will be mentions of sexual assault, which can be triggering for some folks. So if you feel the need to step away, just do whatever you need to take care of yourself. Like I said, we trust you to know what's best for you. Be open to new ideas and perspectives while we're all here learning together. Ask questions. Whatever you need to know, we want to provide you with that information. So you can send questions anonymously to the host, and we will pause halfway through to answer some questions, and then we'll also be sticking around at the end of the session to kind of get more in depth into those discussions. So if you want to hang out with us at the end, Devin and I will be here for a while. We're trying to keep this space a no judgment zone. I understand that some people might disagree with some of the things that people say, and everybody's bringing their own perspectives and experiences, but do try to keep that judgment to a minimum, and then take notes, especially on how you can start to apply these concepts with the young people in your life. All right, so we have a little interactive portion here that we're going to get into. So I just want to recognize to start that teaching consent to kids is not an easy thing to do. Adults are really, tasked with these kind of two conflicting things that they have to do. They are responsible for making sure that the young people in their lives are healthy and safe and have access to the things that they need, which means that sometimes adults need to make decisions for kids, whether it's something about their safety or just something it just happens sometimes that adults need to make decisions for kids. But it's also our responsibility to start introducing these concepts of consent into kids' lives. So how do we balance these two kind of conflicting things? We're going to look at some examples in this Zoom poll here in a second. And it's important to note that although many of us might have this idea in our head of consent that relates mostly to like sexual situations or dating and things like that, but we really want to, what we want to drive home in this workshop is that consent really applies to all human interactions, even just those kind of regular day-to-day activities. And so this poll is going to include a list of a number of different day-to-day activities that a parent or caregiver might ask a child or young person in their life to do at some point. And I would like all of you to select the ones that you think require that young person's consent. And then we will discuss more afterwards. So I'm going to launch this poll here. All right, so if you want to send in your responses, you can see that some of the options we have here are asking a young person to clean their room, asking a young person to give their parent a hug, getting a shot at the doctor, having a young person do their homework, having a young person get a haircut, asking them to eat all the food on their plate, or sharing a room with a sibling. So we'll give people some time to vote here. Looks like the answers are rolling in. We'll just give it a few more seconds. Sorry, there's a bit of a lag when we're doing these online polls. All right, I'm going to end this poll now since most people have voted, and I'll share our results. All right, so we can see that, you know, it looks like there are at least a few responses for each of these options. And that really illustrates the point that I'm trying to make here, is that basically, yeah, in theory, you should be asking your child for consent in all things, but there are also times when you need to make a decision for them and you're not going to be able to like really get their consent. So there's not necessarily a whole lot of consensus around what things require a child's consent, what things don't. It looks like the more sort of physical things like giving your parent a hug or sharing a room, getting a haircut, there are a lot of votes for those. And those are definitely things where it's sort of easier to put that completely in the child's control. But basically a good rule of thumb is giving kids the option to, or giving kids as much control over a situation and as many options in that situation as possible, even if you can't really realistically get their consent. So for example, let's use this getting a shot at the doctor. There are few, if no, children in this world who would be just like raring to go get a shot at the doctor. Nobody, if you ask your child, do you want to go get your tetanus shot? No child is going to be like, yeah, this is my favorite thing. But in that situation where you have to make that decision for them, where you're deciding that this vaccine is something that they have to get for their own safety, you can still try to introduce some other elements of control and choice into that situation. So for example, you could ask the child, you know, do you want to get the shot in your left arm or your right arm? Do you want me to hold your hand while you get the shot, or do you want me to like leave you alone? And so even though you are ultimately making that decision for them about them getting that vaccine, you're still giving them some choices in that situation. So basically the summary of this is that consent is going to look really different in lots of different situations, and that you will be able to get a greater degree of consent in certain everyday situations, especially with children, than you would in others. But that modeling, this asking for and receiving consent as an adult is really, really helpful for helping young people to develop these abilities to make their own decisions and advocate for themselves, and really start to understand that they are the masters of their own bodies, which are really positive things. All right, I'm going to shut this poll down now.
Got it. All right, so like Addie was saying, a lot of times we tend to think of consent as something that is related strictly to dating or sexual relationships or romantic relationships, but consent is something that we can start discussing and teaching our children about from when they're very small up until they're grown and out of the house. It's a lifelong learning process. So even really young children need to learn to say no. That's a skill that they can practice, and that can be really difficult for a lot of people. This can be really difficult for adults. I have a very hard time saying no. I get a lot of anxiety about it because I think saying no to somebody is going to upset them or inconvenience them. Maybe they won't like me anymore. And so I have a lot of anxiety about saying no, and it's a thing that I still have to practice even as an adult. So we can begin to teach children how to say no. We can also teach them how to hear and respect other people's no. So just like some people may have a hard time saying no, people may also have a hard time hearing no. Because again, it can sometimes feel like a rejection or a bad thing, or maybe somebody is saying no because they don't like you anymore. So sometimes we have a lot of negative feelings about hearing other people tell us no. But by teaching our young people to really hear and respect no, and that it's okay, and that it's not a bad thing, it's not a rejection, by teaching them that it's just somebody else enforcing their personal boundaries, we begin to teach them not only to respect other people's boundaries, but that it's okay for them to enforce and have their own, to say no. We can also be teaching our young people how to identify body language or nonverbal cues of other people's discomfort. And that also is a skill, learning to recognize those signs in other people, that we can begin teaching our children very young. And oftentimes these conversations with smaller children don't necessarily have that language around consent that you may be more familiar with. Oftentimes these conversations focus more around kindness or discussions around sharing. Asking another child, like, hey, can I play with your toy? Can I play with your toy is asking for consent. So as our young people grow, as they become preteens and teenagers, and they enter into more complicated relationships, as they enter into more complex situations, the conversations that we have with them around consent can also become more complex. You may bring up consent as a concept by itself. You may begin to use more of that language that we're familiar with, that we tend to be familiar with around consent, particularly when we're talking around dating and sexual situations. Young people, when they become preteens and teenagers, are dealing a lot more with situations where those skills like saying no, or thinking about consent really matter in situations like peer pressure, when they're being pressured to do drugs or alcohol, or around dating and sexual relationships. Those skills really come into play, and those conversations become a lot more complex and relevant to their lives. One of the things that I think is really essential that we talk about with our young people when we begin to teach them a more nuanced understanding of consent is introducing the idea of how pleasure and consent are very much interconnected with each other. This is something that I think is left out of a lot of sex education curriculums, but when we teach our young people that they have the right to experience pleasure in their sexual or dating relationships, when we teach them that they have the right to feel good in their bodies and in those situations, it can really help give them more of a framework for understanding consent in different situations. It should feel safe. It should feel good. And this is especially important when we begin to have conversations about gender roles and consent. So we know that gender is not a binary. We know that there are people who exist with gender identities that are not man or woman. We know gender is a spectrum. However, we also know that the messages our young people get around sexuality and consent are very much connected to this male-female binary. And the messages that they are getting is very much dependent on whether or not they're perceived as a woman or a girl, or whether or not they're perceived as a man or a boy. So we see young women getting lots of conflicting messages around sex. You know, you're either a slut or you're a prude. There's not really any way for a young woman to win in sexual situations. Whereas young men learn that They always have to be open and willing to any sexual opportunities. And if they're not, like, a lot of times people will question their masculinity. So they learn that they always have to be ready to say yes. Women get messages, or people that are perceived as women get messages that if they say no, it might threaten their physical safety. We hear these news stories all the time about the woman who said no to giving a man her phone number and wound up in the hospital. And the other side of that is that men are taught to fear rejection. That is the worst thing that for them that can come out of those situations. It's not physical harm, it's just that, again, kind of a threat to their masculinity, that fear of being rejected. We see that young men get messages about being entitled to other people's bodies, and we see this happen on the streets in the forms of catcalling or street harassment, in groping in public spaces, even in things like dress codes. We see that young women getting messages that other people are entitled to their bodies. They have to put up with those catcalls and not really do or say anything. They have to make sure that they're wearing clothing that it has been deemed appropriate, so that they don't distract other men or boys around them. We also see young men getting messages that it's okay for them to show their bodies. It's a very opposite message from young women being told to cover up and to hide to make other people around them comfortable. And we really see these messages overall play into the messages our young people are getting around sexual assault. We tell young women to watch what they're wearing, keep their drink with them at all times, always go to the bathroom with a buddy, walk to your car with your keys between your knuckles, whereas young men definitely are not getting those messages. And they're also generally not getting messages like, don't put drugs in people's drinks, or don't holler at people on the street. And oftentimes we see that when we do try and have these conversations with young men, there's a lot of pushback, there's a lot of fear, and there's a lot of defensiveness, as if we are accusing them of being predators. So ultimately, when we're thinking about the messages that our young people are getting, we see that young women are told to accept that other people have more control over their bodies than they do, and that they are taught to please and provide, make other people comfortable by modifying or monitoring their behavior, whereas men are taught that they are entitled to others' bodies and that they are entitled to receiving and expecting pleasure. So the way that we see this come up oftentimes in classrooms or with young people who are trying to think about and explore this idea of consent, these are some of the really common questions that we get. And I think that these questions really demonstrate where the holes are in the conversations that we're having with our young people. So conversations that are missing an element where we discuss pleasure or discuss those gendered messages. So like a lot of young people will ask, doesn't consent ruin the mood? And I mean, it's an understandable question. You know, if you think about the movies and the television shows that these young people are constantly consuming, very rarely does a character ask, like, can I kiss you? Because that's not seen as romantic or sexy or whatever it's supposed to be. So really talking and teaching our young people that asking for consent is not only mandatory, it's also normal, and it's a part of ensuring that your partner is invested and enthusiastic and willing to do whatever the activity is. It's really ensuring that aspect of mutual pleasure, right? You're ensuring that everybody is really interested in what's going on. And we also get a lot of questions about the connection between alcohol and sex. So if two people are drinking on a date and later have sex, is it sexual assault? Why is it that the man is the one charged with rape if both people were drinking? So again, we don't want to suggest that only women can get assaulted. We know that people of any gender can experience sexual assault, But by thinking back to those gendered messages that our young people are receiving, we can start to help them understand that men are socialized, or people perceived as men are socialized to not take no for an answer, and to be very persistent in terms of sex at any cost, right? And so we can start to figure out how to answer some of these questions by thinking about some of the messages that they're getting. So we're going to pause and see if any questions or comments have come in so far that need to be addressed.
So far, we do not have anything in the chat. But if anyone wants to drop a question in there while they're thinking of it, or you can save it till the end. As we continue through the content, though, please do feel free to just type your questions in as you're thinking of them, and then we will have a longer discussion about them at the end. So no need to hold them in until the end. All right, so this is just a bit of a roadmap of the content that we're going to be covering for the rest of this workshop. We're going to go over all of these topics much more in depth after this, but I just kind of wanted to give you all a little sense of what we're going to be doing for the rest of this hour. So we're going to be talking about the fact that consent requires more than just somebody saying yes. And then we'll get more in depth into this idea of the enthusiastic yes and why that's so important for consent. Then we're going to dive into body sovereignty and talk about what that is, how we can help children and other young people develop that concept within themselves. And then we'll be talking about the importance of nonverbal communication to close us out. So when we're talking about this idea of consent being more than just yes, and also getting into this idea of enthusiastic yes, we have this very handy little mnemonic device that we like to use, particularly for illustrating this point, just because it really shows how these 5 concepts are so essential to this core idea of consent. So consent has to be freely given. An example that I like to use for this is, let's say 2 young people are in a relationship and a young person is maybe pressuring their partner to have sex and saying, you know, if you don't have sex with me, then I'm going to break up with you. This is obviously not going to allow for freely given consent, because there's that element of coercion there that's making it so that partner can't give consent freely. Consent is also reversible. And so I'm going to switch it up a little bit here. And because we're talking about this idea of consent applying in sexual situations, but also in non-sexual situations, I'm going to use some non-sexual examples in here as well. So this one is very non-sexual and also a little silly, but I think it illustrates the point really well. So if consent is reversible, let's say somebody walks up to you on the street and offers you $1,000 and you're like, yeah, I'll take $1,000. That sounds great. And then after they've already given you the money, they say, oh wait, actually, you do have to wrestle an alligator in order to get this money though. Even if you've already taken that check and cashed it in your bank account, even if you already spent that $1,000, you are allowed to reverse your consent at any point, because that $1,000 is not going to cover your medical bills when you get mauled by that alligator. So I would really suggest maybe reversing your consent at that point. And obviously this is a silly example, but this does apply in other situations as well. You can reverse your consent at any point, no matter how far down the road of that activity you've gotten. Consent also has to be informed. So this means that somebody needs to be aware of all of the context surrounding that situation before they can actually give their informed consent. So let's say 2 people are engaging in sexual activity and one person removes a condom without telling their partner that they're taking their condom off. This would be removing that element of informed consent, because when that person consented to that sexual activity, they consented to sex with a condom. And when that contraception is removed, they're no longer aware of all of the facts surrounding the situation, so they can't give informed consent. Consent also is enthusiastic, so this is getting deeper into that idea of the enthusiastic yes that I mentioned. So let's say a young person is visiting grandma and grandpa, and you as a parent ask, hey, do you want to give your grandma a hug? And the young person just kind of shrugs and is like, yeah, I guess so. that's not really enthusiasm. And this is something that we see pretty often, especially as children are getting a little bit older and their boundaries might be changing. The things that maybe they were once comfortable with, they're not as comfortable with anymore. And so in this situation, as a parent, if it would be really great to just be like, hey, I can see that you're maybe not feeling super enthusiastic about that option. How about, would you be okay with just giving grandma a hug or a high five instead? And so just providing them with some alternative options there so that they can find an option that they're more comfortable with, since they weren't enthusiastic about the idea of giving grandma a kiss. And lastly, but not least, consent is specific. So this means that if somebody consents to a specific type of activity, that doesn't mean that they've consented to anything that comes after that. So let's say a young person says that they want to text with their friend, and they're texting, everything's going great, and then all of a sudden the friend sends a shirtless picture, unprompted. That young person did not consent to that specific type of communication. They consented to just regular texting, but not sending shirtless pictures. And so that would not be a consenting situation then. So now we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into that enthusiastic yes portion of this, because this is really, really critical. So just because somebody doesn't say no doesn't mean that they're consenting. Like, a lack of a no does not equal consent. And there are a lot of reasons that somebody might not feel able to say no, or might feel compelled to say yes in a situation, but that still doesn't necessarily mean that consent has been obtained. Like, just a vibe or kind of an idea that somebody might be into something is not the same thing as getting that enthusiastic verbal yes. So as parents and caregivers, I think a lot of people who, have spent a lot of time with one particular young person get pretty good at reading that young person's body language, and might be able to kind of tell what that child is feeling without having to ask them for it. But it's still really important for adults to model this behavior, because young people will then see you doing this behavior and asking for that enthusiastic verbal yes, and then they can start to employ this in other situations as well, especially with other young people. So when you're modeling that behavior, you can also set the expectation that the young person you're modeling that behavior to will then do the same thing with other people in their life, even with adults, because that's just really, really good practice. And then we do want to talk to young people also about the fact that alcohol, drugs, and other things, kind of like Devin was mentioning, just really make this more complicated, and can really diminish a person's ability to actually consent to a situation, and can even make somebody seem really enthusiastic about something when they're legally unable to consent. So, this is something where if two people are just drinking and both of them are drinking and then they have consenting sexual relations, it can get kind of complicated. But what we really wanted to point out here is that people should be careful of this predatory behavior when it comes to drugs and alcohol and other things that can limit somebody's ability to consent. So like Devin mentioned when we were talking about gendered messaging and common questions that we get about consent, although people of all genders can be sexually assaulted, it is much more common for men to be accused of assaulting women. And this might in part be because there's some predatory behavior there. So for example, if somebody was deliberately seeking out a partner who they could see had already had a lot to drink because they thought that might make somebody more likely to have sex with them, or if somebody was deliberately over-serving their partner and plying them with alcohol to get them drunk, these are examples of predatory behavior that might contribute to some of those common questions that we were discussing earlier. So I am going to pick a volunteer now to help me out with some of these practice scenarios that we have here. So I am going to choose Carrie. Would you be willing to help me out with this one?
Sure, why not?
Awesome, thank you. So in this first example, we have siblings, Sammy and Morgan. And Sammy asks to play with Morgan's action figure. Morgan doesn't respond, but Sammy decides to take the action figure anyway and start playing. So you as an adult in this situation, how would you address this and model asking for consent in this situation?
I guess with this one, right, because it doesn't say that that Morgan responded. So I assume Morgan didn't say yes if they didn't respond. And based on what you were just talking about, like there has to be that yes, right? So I guess the key thing to talk to Sammy about is to say, Sammy, if you ask somebody for something and they don't say yes, you have to make sure they have told you it's okay to do that. Don't just assume because they didn't say anything, you can do that.
Right, yeah, that is exactly right. So this gets back to this idea of consent being more than the absence of a no. So just because Morgan didn't say no, you can't take my action figure, doesn't mean Sammy gets to assume that they get to play with the action figure. So just really reinforcing to Sammy, you know, just because Morgan didn't say that you couldn't have the action figure, that's not the same thing as Morgan saying that you can play with it. So you really need to ask for permission and you need to wait for Morgan to say yes before you can start playing with their toys. But that was great, thank you. And if you'd be willing to help me out with the second example too, I would be eternally grateful.
Sure, so, I'll take the second one.
Thanks, Carrie. So Sam and Morgan have grown up now, they're teenagers, and they often share their gym uniform at school. But one day, Sam comes to school and notices that Morgan is wearing Sam's favorite t-shirt. And when Sam approaches Morgan about it, Morgan says it's the same thing as them sharing gym clothes, so it shouldn't be a problem. So how would you maybe address this situation at home and introduce that idea of consent into this situation?
Yeah, I guess since they're teenagers, maybe I would, instead of just directly telling them, ask in this case, okay, you know, as hopefully get their thoughts on it first, but then, because as you mentioned, like we're talking about consent more as the term as opposed to just like, be nice. But then I would probably make sure we got to the point that like saying, having an agreement about one item does not mean you have an agreement about the rest of the things your sibling is okay with you just taking from them without asking and getting that, again, like that verbal permission.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this is a great opportunity to really bring back that specific idea of consent, that last part of Fry's, and basically just, illustrate to Sam and Morgan that, you know, just because Sam is okay with Morgan wearing your gym uniform doesn't mean that Sam specifically consented to Morgan wearing his favorite t-shirt. And so really need to get that specific enthusiastic yes in that situation about that specific t-shirt in order for this to be a consenting situation. That was great. Thank you so much for your help, Carrie.
You're welcome.
All right, so we are going to dig into this idea of body sovereignty. And I know that the word sovereignty can be kind of intimidating, but really what this means is just that everyone should have the right to control their body. And this includes when and how they're touched, their personal space, how much or how little somebody is comfortable with, their clothing choices, what they put on their body, their food choices, what they put in their body, and their appearance. And this includes everything from their hair to makeup to jewelry. And so one of the things so for an example of this, thinking about food choices, we mentioned earlier in that beginning poll, the having a young person, having a child eat everything on their plate. And so it can be really helpful to enforce this idea that young people are the experts on their bodies and how they feel by really respecting them when they say things like, I'm full. So not being like, no, you're not, you need to eat 5 more bites. You know, those phrases when I was growing up, it was, you have to eat as many bites as you are old. That was our rule. It can make a child like question, like, am I really full? And we really want them to have a sense that they know their bodies best. So letting them like leave the table and not forcing them to finish that plate can really help them gain that confidence in their body. Now, this does not mean that child can come back an hour later and be like, I'm hungry, I want a bag of chips, or I'm hungry, can I have some ice cream, right? And at that moment, it's your responsibility as the adult to really set boundaries, and you know, pull their dinner plate out of the fridge and be like, okay, you can finish your dinner. So this really goes into some of the ways that we can help our young people develop that sense and that confidence in their own body sovereignty. So giving them control within boundaries. And we do want to make it clear that the amount of control young people have over their bodies is going to differ depending on how old they are. You know, for example, a 4-year-old, if you're getting a 4-year-old dressed for school, you're not going to say to them, pick out anything that you want. That's too overwhelming of a choice for them. But you can say, do you want to wear your red shirt or your blue shirt today? When they're a little older, when they're 9 or 10, maybe instead of those 2 options, they can choose anything they want to wear out of a particular drawer. And then by the time they become teenagers, by the time they're 16, 17, 18, they have the run of their closet, right? And the amount of control that and the boundaries that we give them, it's really important to recognize we need to help foster and grow their confidence in that control of themselves, of their bodies. Because especially as they become teenagers, they will be out in the world where they have to make complete decisions over what is happening to those bodies. So making sure they feel confident and comfortable in exerting that control is really important. It's also important to give them the words they need to communicate. So this can be helping them learn to identify feelings. Are you frustrated? Are you sad? Are you happy? Are you angry? So giving them that vocabulary to talk about how they're feeling, but also giving them the accurate vocabulary to talk about their bodies. So teaching them, you know, this is a penis, this is a vulva, this is a vagina. Giving them accurate body words can also help to reduce any sense of shame or stigma about their physical body, and help reinforce that confidence that your body is normal, your body is yours, there's nothing wrong with that body. And the last thing that we can do is give them support when they're enforcing their boundaries. So when I was very young, I really loved the idea of sleepovers. I loved the idea of like going to a friend's house and staying up all night and eating candy and watching movies. But it would hit a certain point of the night where I was like, nope, I need to be home. I need to be in my bed. I need my parents down the hall. I need my nightlight. And I would call my dad usually around midnight or 1 o'clock and have him come pick me up. And my dad never got angry with me. He never yelled at me. He never lectured me. Do I think he was necessarily happy to be like out and about at 1 a.m.? Probably not. But he never made me feel bad for enforcing that boundary. Flash forward to many years later when I'm a sophomore in high school, baby Devin was very straight and narrow. I was like a very young 15. I didn't drink, I didn't go out, I didn't do anything like that. But I did go to prom. And after prom, I wound up at this college party with my date. There were college students, there were people doing drugs, there were people drinking, and I was horrified. I didn't want to be there. I was extremely uncomfortable. And I called my dad, and he came, he picked me up. It wound up being like 3 a.m. But again, he didn't lecture me. I didn't get in trouble. He just said, I'm glad that you called me and I'm glad that you're safe. And that was the end of the conversation. And so I knew that he would support me in enforcing my boundaries and that he was a safe adult for me to call and get help from. So we can always offer support for our young people and help them enforce those boundaries, whether it's giving grandma a kiss or not making them stay at a sleepover, you know, we can let them know we're in their corner. So we're gonna do another example here. And I'm gonna call on somebody, and so we have 2 scenarios. And in one scenario, body sovereignty is being supported, and in the other scenario, it is not. So I'm gonna ask somebody which scenario they think the body sovereignty was not being supported and what they could have done differently. So in example 1, we have a 4-year-old who needs their hair done before school. The adult offers options of hairstyles such as ponytail or braid. So that's example 1. Example 2, we have a 17-year-old who has an appointment with the barber. The parent calls ahead without telling the teen and gives the barber instructions on the cut. So let's see here. I am going to call on Paula, if that's okay.
Well, hello.
Hello, Paula. Are you comfortable fielding this example?
Yes, thank you. Thanks
Great.
for asking.
Yeah, so can you tell us which example you think body sovereignty was not supported?
Where it would not support it? Number 2. I don't think it's supported in number 2.
Yeah, why do you think that?
Because I have a 15-year-old son who would not be happy. Because
Fair enough.
because I'm making that decision for them when they are mature enough to make that decision on their own, and it's something very personal to them. It is part of their body and their being.
Yeah, exactly. So what could you have done, or what do you think the parent in this situation could have done differently?
I think this parent could have talked to the teen, and perhaps they could have looked at some photos together of people with different haircuts, and then, you know, the child could have looked at the different options and had a discussion, and the child could have made the decision.
That is excellent. So you brought up a couple of really important points. So the first is obviously the adult talking to the young person in this situation. And giving, in that instance, you're giving them some options, right? You're talking together, like these are different possibilities for your haircut, while also recognizing that ultimately they are the decider about how their body is going to look. You also brought up this idea of, I think, talking about the why with our young people. So sometimes, maybe not necessarily in this situation, but sometimes we have to make decisions for our young people as the adults, like when they're at the doctor getting that shot, right? Or maybe in this example, next week is grandma's very fancy birthday party and you don't really want your kid going with a mohawk because there's going to be pictures and grandma will be shocked. So having that conversation also gives you an opportunity to talk about your why. This is why I want this for you, or this is why I would prefer your hair to look like this. And that can help your young people make informed decisions. But in the end, I think you kind of came to that conclusion, and you said pretty clearly that they are their own person and it's their body, and they get to make that personal choice about how they appear to the world. In that first example, we have a 4-year-old who is on their way to preschool. So we as the adult know that their hair needs to go up. At preschool, there's candy, there's markers, there's scissors. The hair has to go up. But the adult is still giving that small child an option to choose between a ponytail and a braid. They're still giving them an element of control over their body. So thank you, Paula, for chiming in and helping us out with that example. That was a great response.
Thanks.
All right. So we like to use this example of the house analogy. So everybody's body is their own personal house. And that means that you get to decide how to decorate it, the level of upkeep. You get to decide who comes over. And if you think about those elements of fries, you can really start to see how this applies, right? So just because you have invited somebody over to watch a movie does not mean they get to go into your kitchen and make a mess baking a cake. That's not the specific thing that you consented to. Or just because you've invited somebody over last Friday doesn't mean that they get to come over this Friday whenever they want. Or if you did invite somebody over, if they start to act crazy or weird, you can reverse that consent and ask them to leave. So you really get to control what happens to your body, who gets to touch it for how long and in what ways. Our bodies are our own, and we really get to control all the different aspects of what that means.
All right, so now we're going to get a little bit deeper into nonverbal cues or body language, depending on the age of the young person you're talking to this about. You might want to decide to use one of those terms over the other. But things like facial expression, posture, someone's hand placement, their positioning relative to other people and objects in that space can really tell us a lot about how that person is feeling. So some ways that we can help young people in our lives start to pay attention to body language are pointing out when we notice their a young person's body language and pointing out what we think that means when they do certain things with their body. And then also helping them, this helps them start to recognize similar cues in other people. And so pointing out that body language that you notice in them, like for instance, if they were to come home from school and get in the car and maybe their arms are crossed and they're looking kind of grumpy, you could say like, oh, I noticed your arms are crossed and you don't look super happy. Do you want to tell me more about what that's about? And then you can start to really assign meaning to these different types of body language. And then once you start to assign meaning of like emotions and these things to that young person's body language, then they can start to understand what that body language means in other people as well. So just kind of continuing to quiz kids on these things so that they can learn. You know, if you're in a situation and you notice people's nonverbal cues, pointing that out to the young person and saying like, hey, what do you notice here? What do you think that means? And it just really helps them practice and start to kind of decipher what all of this body language means. And then lastly, just making sure that if a young person does violate a person's boundaries, or if an adult violates a young person's boundaries, that you're modeling that behavior of correcting and apologizing for that behavior. So let's go back to the example that Devin was talking about with the 17-year-old whose parent called the barber and gave them instructions on how to cut their hair. Hopefully that parent would realize not too long after the fact that maybe that was not the coolest thing to do to your 17-year-old child. And so a really good way to model this behavior in that situation would be to correct and apologize for the adult to do that, to say, you know, I realized that I kind of maybe crossed a line and it was a little out of bounds for me to tell the barber how your hair should be cut since you're 17 and you can make that decision for yourself. And I'm really sorry that I did that. And making sure that when we're teaching, when we're modeling this behavior of correcting and apologizing, that we're modeling apologizing for the behavior and not for the other person's reaction to that behavior. Americans in general are very bad at this. We are huge fans of the if-pology in our culture and essentially saying, I'm sorry if you were upset by this, or basically apologizing for the other person's behavior when really, or for the other person's emotional reaction, when what we should be taking ownership of and taking responsibility for it is our own harmful behavior. So we have another fun little practice scenario here now. So we'll do this in a very similar way. I'm going to call on MJ. Are you okay helping me out with this one?
I am, yes.
Awesome, thank you so much. So in this first example, we have a young child who's at the swimming pool and their older sibling is encouraging them to jump in, but this child crosses their arms and sits down by the side of the pool. As an adult in that situation, how would you address that and maybe try to get the older sibling to recognize that young person's body language and what they're trying to communicate?
So I guess I would talk. So are these my kids?
Sure, they can be your kids.
Sure. Okay, so I would talk to my older child and say, you know, look at, you know, your younger siblings' body language, like clearly they don't want to do this, so you need to back off.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously the way that you address this would change depending on whether they were your children or other young people who maybe you have less authority over. But that's really good. You know, it's pointing out, taking the time to point out to that older child the body language that their younger sibling is exhibiting, and then explaining to them what this body language means as well, so that they can really start to assign meaning to what their younger sibling is doing. And then just making it clear that, you know, if your younger sibling is showing that they're really not into this right now, then we need to stop pressuring them. And we need to recognize that they're not actually able to consent in that situation because we're pressuring them. But that's great, thank you. So in this second example, if you'd be willing to help me with this, we're moving on to teenagers now. So there's a teenager who keeps putting their arm around their friend's shoulder, and their friend keeps shrugging them off over and over, but that teenager just keeps putting their arm back there. How would you, as an adult, get the teenager who keeps putting their arm around their friend to correct and apologize in this situation?
Well, it's a little tougher, right? Because they're teenagers. So, I mean, if it's my teenager that is the one that keeps getting hugs without being, without wanting them, I would work with my teen to really stand up for themselves and to say no to their friend who was being overly affectionate.
Yeah, that's good. So helping the teen in that situation who is uncomfortable with their friend doing that, to kind of gain some of those self-advocacy skills is really, really important. But it's also okay to talk to the teen who is the one who is violating their friend's boundaries and keeps putting their arm around the shoulder. Just pointing out in that situation, hey, I noticed that you keep putting your arm around your friend's shoulder and your friend keeps shrugging you off. What do you think that means? And since they are teenagers, they can probably, kind of extrapolate a little bit more there, and whereas a younger child might not be able to make the connection between my friend keeps shrugging me off, maybe that means they don't like what I'm doing. A teenager should, in theory, be able to do that, and so hopefully they would make that connection. If they didn't make that connection, you could say, it's pretty clear that your friend doesn't like what you're doing right now, and just because you're their friend doesn't mean that you are entitled to do whatever you want to their body. Consent is still required in this situation, even if you've known each other since birth. Like, it doesn't mean that you're entitled to your friend's body just because you're pals. So hopefully you would be able to maybe convey that a little more subtly, but it's also okay to be really direct in that situation if that's what the teenager needs.
Absolutely. Well, in I have one teenager who's very passive and would let a friend sort of hug her without standing up for herself. So, I was definitely thinking about that in terms of like helping my, one teen who would have a harder time saying no.
Definitely. Yeah. And that's something that I, as a teenager, would have had a really hard time with too. It's something that I still struggle with, and that Devin said she struggles with as well. Like, telling people no is just really, really hard, especially when you're young. Thank you so much for helping out with those, MJ. That was great.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. So we are almost at the end of this workshop here. Thank you all so much for sticking with us through this. I hope it was enjoyable for you. So just a little summary of what we've covered. We talked about how important it is to start teaching about consent early and to continue that education for years. So it's great to start teaching about these things as early as possible. If you start to really introduce these ideas of consent and just paying attention to other people's body language and behavior, it really starts to become second nature for a child, which is wonderful. But I also want to make it clear that no matter what age the young people in your life are, it's never too late to start having these discussions, because I certainly didn't have discussions, like open discussions about consent with my parents when I was a child. And then I started learning about it eventually, and I've gotten to where I am now. So it's never too late to start learning about consent. But generally, the earlier you can start, the easier it is to really put consent into practice in your life. We talked about the fact that messages around consent are often really gendered and how this can complicate things around consent. We discussed the fact that consent requires all parts of FRIES, which is freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. If you don't have those 5, there's no consent. And lastly, we talked about body sovereignty, the importance of enthusiastic yes in situations where we're getting consent, and also the importance of nonverbal cues and paying attention to people's body language. So we have some suggested take-home challenges for you to start practicing these things at home with the young people in your lives. So if you're somebody who maybe has a slightly younger child at home, I would challenge you to think about one thing that you can give that child more control over, whether that's what they want to have for after school snack or what color they want to paint their room. That might be a little too much control depending on the age of the child, but that's up to you, parents. Or whether that's, yeah, just one thing, one simple, small thing in their life that you can give them more control over. It might not even seem like that big of a deal to you, but it'll just help them really start to make those decisions and just get comfortable with this idea that like I'm in control of my own body. And if you are a parent or caregiver of a slightly older child, maybe a teenager or young adult, try having a discussion with them about gendered messaging around consent and how this affects young people and how this can make conversations around consent more complicated, especially once young people get to this age where they're starting to think a little bit more about sex and dating.
So we really want to, again, thank you all for being here for this presentation. We hope that there were pieces of it that were useful for you. We are going to be sending out a feedback form that will, I believe, also include some information, because we did touch on elements or the topic of sexual assault. It will include some resources around that. You can always contact us at ppil.education@ppil.org. And we are going to stick around, like Addie said at the beginning. We have a couple of questions in the chat that we will address. And we also welcome any sort of feedback that you all have for us after this. And if you are interested in our next session, which we'll be discussing gender and sexual identity, you can take a picture of this QR code if you have an iPhone, and it should pull up the registration page. If you do not have an iPhone, if you have like an Android or some other type of cell phone, I don't know what else exists, but you can download a QR reader application, and it'll pull it up that way. But like I said, we will be sending out a follow-up that'll also include the registration link. So don't panic if you have an Android and don't know how to grab this QR code here. So we do have a couple of questions.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just about to drop a link to a feedback survey in the chat for everyone. So if you're still here and you feel like giving us some feedback, we would appreciate that. And we do have some questions. Yay.
All right, so the first question was, what tactics do you use to help a young teen unlearn the toxic messages around their entitlement to other people's bodies, especially if they already exhibit a disregard for consent? How can we shift that perspective? Addie, do you want to take a stab at this first, or should I?
I can try.
Okay.
That's a tough one, especially because to some extent teenagers are going to do their teenage thing, and they will sometimes, you know, be kind of deliberately contrary. I definitely was as a teenager, and so if my parents had come to me, or if I was somebody who had been exhibiting a disregard for consent, I don't know that my parents telling me, you know, you really need to be better about consent would have had an effect, at least not the desired effect. But I think ways that you can start to shift this perspective, I would say, honestly, maybe this message would come better from another young person. Like if there were other young people in that teen's life who maybe had a better grasp of the ideas of consent, or could just start to have those conversations with them in like a slightly less heightened situation. I don't know. This is a really hard one. Devin, do you have any other ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think it is really hard. Unlearning is definitely more of a process than learning. You know, we've talked a lot in this presentation about kind of the socialization and the messages that young people are already getting around consent from movies, from TV, from their peers. So it can be really hard as the adult to help them unlearn those more toxic messages. I think that the first step is really modeling as the adult in their lives. So as much as possible, making sure that you are asking them for consent and like really pushing for those verbal yeses that Addie was talking about. And also, you know, you are the adult in their life. You can really push them to ask for those things from you, so that they are forced with at least one person in their life to really practice asking for consent before they touch you or hug you or, you know, go into your room or wear your clothes, whatever it is. You can really kind of be that force in their life that is pushing them to at least begin to practice these skills. And it is, we don't want anybody to think that this is like a one-time conversation. Hopefully what you've taken from this is that these are conversations that take place throughout somebody's lives. So maybe you begin just talking about some of those gendered messages that we talked about with that young person. And from there, you can begin having conversations around maybe fries or, you know, when you're watching television or movies or whatever, start initiating some of those conversations around consent so they're at least thinking about it. I am like a big fan of like reading, and there are lots of books out there that where there are conversations or there are issues or models of healthy relationships and healthy examples of consent. And so depending on like, are they a reader? Are they into movies? Are they into a certain television show? Using those as springboards to begin having those conversations, it's a start. It's a start to help at least get them thinking about this stuff, and unlearning some of it. And like I said, modeling and really making them practice those skills with you, even if they're not always like super happy about it. But it's a good practice, is what I would say.
Yeah, and I thought of one other thing as well.
Yeah.
Potentially maybe trying to, because I know, at least I personally, sometimes learn things better when I can connect it to a personal example of something that's happened to me in my life. And so if you could maybe try to get that young person to think of a time in their life when someone did something to their body that they didn't enjoy, when somebody sort of felt entitled to their body and that made them uncomfortable in some way. I mean, it's not, that might not be an easy thing to come up with an example of, but like, for instance, the example that we talked about during the workshop of like of parents asking children to give their grandma a kiss. Like that was something that happened to me all the time as a child. I was always expected to give my grandma a kiss and let her give me a kiss back. And so maybe something even as simple as that, like really bringing it back to something like that. I mean, it's just, this is a tough thing to teach to children. It really is. But props to you for trying. We appreciate that.
All right, we also had another question. This related back to the toy example that you gave, Addie. So what would you do in the case that Sammy does not comply when you explain the importance of consent? So how would you handle the situation escalating with Sammy not understanding? I mean, I think as adults, as parents, we recognize that these conversations with our young people are not going to go perfectly. They're not always going to go as planned, and that's okay. That's a part of life. That's part of being parents. That's part of teaching young people. Sometimes you have to like let that situation go and try again tomorrow, and that's okay. You know, especially young children, they're going to have a lot of feelings. They're going to maybe react negatively in certain situations. If you take a toy away from a small child, they are not taking, you know, not in that situation, like taking it away from Sammy, and like reenacting that negative behavior that you don't want them doing. But, you know, they're going to have negative reactions sometimes. And so maybe Sammy in that situation doesn't want to give the toy back. Maybe they don't want to apologize. You can still be talking to them about why what they did wasn't okay, and what they need to do next time. And maybe in that situation, the win is they apologize to, was it Morgan? Was Morgan the other person? Maybe the win is just that they apologize, and maybe they do go on playing with that toy. And then the next time you're able to catch that situation, and when they're asking to play with the toy, you're able to say, okay, you need to wait and get a response before you take the toy. And it just becomes a matter of practicing and trying again and reinforcing those messages while acknowledging that sometimes it's not going to work out exactly the way you want it to. Abby, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that was really thorough. Yeah, I think the idea, you do to some extent have to pick your battles, right? Like if you can tell that this is going to result in a massive meltdown that's going to like derail the rest of your day, then maybe it's not worth it to try to get Sammy to give Morgan back the toy at that point. But like Devin said, then bringing it up again later when the kids are calmer and just continuing to reinforce that, and then hopefully eventually it will get through and it'll become more natural for the kids, to the point where it's not going to result in like a temper tantrum, at least. So
all right, and then I think we have one more question, maybe. I think. Okay, thank you for the answers. I knew it was gonna be a hard one. You're welcome. We're trying. All right, so somebody else asked, or they gave kind of a scenario. So they have a 15-year-old son, and they have a good relationship in terms of being open and talking to each other. They've talked about the birds and the bees already, but he said that he was dating a girl last year, and the adult reminded him about their talk, and also reminded him about respecting her and consent and things like that. And so that relationship ended, but they are thinking ahead to this next relationship. And if they are introduced to his next girlfriend, they want to know if it's appropriate for them to bring up the topic of consent to both of them or not, because I'm not the girlfriend's mother or adult or guardian.
I mean, I think that would be great to have a talk with consent about both of them. I guess maybe you might want to check with the partner's parents first, just to make sure that they're okay with that. But I mean, especially by the time that people are teenagers, like parents should be okay with their children learning about consent. Like this is essential for them to operate in the world and like succeed. So I think parents should be all right with that. But I guess just to be safe, maybe check with the girlfriend's parents first before you dive into that conversation.
Yeah, I think so. If you missed the previous Let's Talk series, we talk in those ones about addressing tricky topics with our young people. And I believe in one of them they talked about, I'm like losing my thread here, about making that. Oh, okay. In every conversation that we have with young people, we are giving them information, but we're also giving them values. And this is what we talked a lot about in that first presentation. So you do really want to be conscious and careful of the conversations that you're having with other young people, like your child's significant other, because you don't want to necessarily be giving them your personal values and finding out that that's really contrary to what they're learning or getting from their own family at home. So in this scenario, I think the best case is to talk to your child, to talk to your son, again, about those concepts of consent and what a healthy relationship looks like. And because they're teenagers, because he's in a relationship with somebody else, likely he will talk about those things with that partner, which is a way for them to begin having those conversations within the confines of that relationship. without maybe you as the other parent passing along your personal values to the girlfriend. So definitely continue talking to your child. Definitely like set your expectations and give them, you know, your values and the information that you have, and hopefully that will be able to, you know, be a part of this relationship that he has with the young woman or his partner.
And I would say if you do, like, I know Devin and I kind of presented different solutions to this. I think Devin's is probably better, honestly. But if you did end up, like, let's say that your child's girlfriend's parents weren't, like, really just didn't feel like they were equipped to have this type of conversation with her, and you spoke to them and they were like, we really want her to learn these things, but we don't know how to talk about this with her. Can you have a conversation with both of them? Which could happen. It's not unheard of. But in that situation, what I wanted to add was just making sure that you're also checking in with both of the young people in that situation and making sure they're okay with having that conversation with you. Because depending on how long I had been dating my partner, I might not want to talk about consent with their parents. So just making sure that you're checking in with them before you kind of launch into that topic.
All right, I think those are all of our questions.
Yeah, I don't see any others. We can give people a little bit more time to type in last minute if they want to.
Yeah, we'll hang out for a couple more minutes, but again, thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you for your participation. We really appreciate it. It makes these so much more interesting if it's not just us up here lecturing for an hour. So thank you, and please feel free to click on that feedback link, sign up for the next session, and yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you.